Well guys, it's finally here. It's the game I've wanted since I was in elementary school. After dodging hit or miss movie tie-in games and transphobia accusations over the years, I finally got my hands on Hogwarts Legacy. I don't know why it's taken so long for a game in this universe to be made, but we finally got it and there's certainly a lot to say about it. By the way, just in case you were worried, there will be no spoilers in this review. All footage I'm showing on the screen is within the first 25% of the game, so you can feel free to watch. The game starts off with you creating your character. It may not be the deepest character creator out there, but it's more than enough to get the job done. The only real non-positive thing I have to say is some of the hairstyles seem a little too modern for the time period that the game takes place in, but you get over that pretty quickly. But when making your character, you can adjust things like your skin color, your gender, name, even the pitch of your voice. The only thing I can see people really wanting that we didn't get here is the ability to adjust height and weight for your character. That being said though, I think there's more than enough there to really make the witch or wizard you want to be. Since you're creating the character, your backstory is undefined prior to the start of the game. It sort of takes the Bethesda approach where you're expected to fill in the blanks using your imagination and everything is up to your own headcanon on where you come from. Once the story starts though, you do get tiny tidbits of info about your character. You learn that you are a new 5th year student attending Hogwarts for the first time, sometime in the late 1800s. The tutorial starts with you on your way to Hogwarts and something happens that causes you to learn about a rare ability that you possess, not common to most witches and wizards. Now this said ability is important enough that it throws you onto the radar of the main villain of the game, Ranrock. Ranrock is the leader of a group of rebellious goblins and he possesses a special magic of his own as well. After the tutorial, the game throws you into the mystery of figuring out what this ability is and why Ranrock cares so much about it. If I'm being honest here, the story isn't the main draw of the game. It's interesting enough to make you care, but it definitely isn't going to be winning any awards. On that same point though, it doesn't seem like the game is trying to tell a more complex story. It knows exactly what it wants to be and it feels appropriate for this world. Ranrock as a villain is a bit generic, but you can tell the game just really wants to push you into exploring the world as fast as possible. The main quest missions are pretty fun though. They take you to various locations and each quest shakes up the gameplay enough that it doesn't feel tedious. One thing I wish was better though outside the main quests were the side quests. They play out pretty much like any other modern open world game that comes out these days. You run into an NPC, they ask you for a favor, and then you go do it, usually in like some sort of fetch quest form. Sometimes these stories for the side quests can be more interesting than others, but none of them really impressed me. That also goes for the side characters, which feels really disappointing. There were some characters I liked, but there were no characters I felt like I would ride or die for in something like The Witcher or any of the Mass Effect games. And that's disappointing because Harry Potter seems like it would be the perfect game to have great side characters. There's no classmates you feel truly connected to besides like one or two. And the same goes for the professors. I would have liked to have like a trio or a group you really gel with and enjoyed spending time with. Most of the side characters feel like they're just there though. Not to say any of the story or characters or writing are particularly bad, but there's room for improvement in that aspect. If there was a friend you could have that you spend a lot of time with and you could get attached to, I think I would have enjoyed this story a lot more than I did, but it ended up being just okay in the end. Hogwarts Legacy is a beautiful looking game. From the moment you first take control, all you can do is marvel at how good the environment looks. Hogwarts itself is super detailed. The reflection on the floors and the way the halls are decorated gives the castle a feeling of wonder. It's not just like a gothic, old design like in the movies, but Avalanche seems to have taken a mix of inspiration from the books and the films simultaneously. Every single room you step into has an atmospheric feeling, and that's one thing I think the developers nailed about the art design was the atmosphere of the castle. Almost every room has something interesting to look at or observe. In the moments of arriving at Hogwarts, you find these random occurrences, sort of like Red Dead 2 but not nearly as interactive.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, what fun! I won't say my goodbyes. I shall cheer for the boy who says you're telling lies.
I'm not telling lies, Peeves. It was Albert Boot.
No, it wasn't. It was Basil Flack.
Oh, fight! It's a bold attack. Was the Minister a boot or the Minister a flack?
These random events could be anything from Peeves wreaking havoc on students, enchanted items doing things on their own, or just students like sitting around gossiping to each other about what's going on in their lives. The best part is these things aren't really marked on the map, they just happen as you walk by them. It makes Hogwarts feel truly alive as you walk around. I could list out all the random things I've seen happen all day, but the fun is encountering these yourselves. They did a really good job at making it feel like the entire world doesn't revolve around only your character. Outside the castle though, it's not quite as detailed, but it's still pretty impressive. The villages you can visit look very fantastical. There are some interesting things to look at that make the world feel lived in, but you won't really get many random things happening as you would inside Hogwarts. In Hogwarts you get all the randomness I mentioned before, but in these villages I saw the NPCs just repeating and doing the same thing they were doing every time I walked by. It's a little disappointing compared to what you see when first getting into the game, but it's still fun to see these places for the first time. The art design is always great though. Nothing ever seems like it's out of place or not well thought out or copy pasted. You just notice how less alive the world in the surrounding area is compared to inside Hogwarts itself. One thing that impressed me all across the board about Hogwarts Legacy were the graphics options. I played on PS5 using an LG C1, and the options they give you for graphics modes are pretty on par with something like God of War Ragnarok. You have 3 settings if you have a display that has VRR support: Fidelity, Balance, and Performance. Fidelity has all the bells and whistles you would expect, 4K resolution and 30 frames. Performance was a pretty smooth 60 frames per second for me, and the only situations I had frame drops were exiting menus and when there's way too much going on the screen. But that rarely happened to a point where it became annoying. And the balance graphics setting is basically exactly as it sounds. It balances render quality and frames. Where it gets interesting though is you can uncap the frame rate on VRR displays. I started the game out in the balanced graphics setting and I was averaging about 55 to 60 frames per second, which is honestly a lot better than I was expecting. It was noticeable when the frames would drop under 60, but it honestly wasn't unbearable like it is in other games. I consider myself a frame snob, but I quite enjoyed my experience. On performance mode with the frame rate uncapped, I averaged about 60 to 65 frames per second and almost no judder or choppiness. This mode felt very smooth to me. And going back to the graphics, there was one problem that I noticed when playing was that sometimes the texture pop in and draw distances weren't always up to par. Once again, this wasn't too bad, but it was something that was noticeable as I was exploring the world. The combat was one of the biggest surprises for me with just how much there is to it. It's not the deepest combat system ever, but there's actually a lot of weight and rhythm here. You start off with pretty basic spells, but the depth comes from how you can combo those spells together. Instead of button mashing lasers into enemies, you can make an enemy float into the air, hit them with a few basic spells, pull them in with Accio, hit them with a fire spell, push them away, and then disarm them all in one smooth combo. I found it a lot of fun to see how many different spells I could chain together on a single enemy. It kinda gave me a Devil May Cry or Mortal Kombat vibe the way I would juggle enemies in the air with my combos. There's also a combo counter that feels really satisfying once you start getting into the triple digits during fights. Another thing that adds flavor to combat is the ability to throw plants, drink potions, and have beasts help you during fights. This is where the role-playing aspect truly shines. You can have your character be an herbalist that relies on plants that'll roll around and bite enemies, or you could drink potions that turn your skin to stone for better protection. You can have centaurs help you even the odds. There's so many options during combat to truly fight how you want. And I didn't even get into the skill tree that improves your spells too. The skill tree adds even more depth to the combat. You can make the Incendio spell cast a ring of fire around you as well as in front of you. You can make the invisibility more effective during stealth, and you can make certain potions more effective. There's just a lot more to it than I was expecting. You can really fine tune your kit to make your character play exactly as you want to play. Even with all these tools at your disposal, the combat never feels too easy either. I wasn't expecting to have as much trouble as I had when fighting. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by enemies if you aren't constantly paying attention to where they are. It's not too difficult, but it felt like just the right amount of difficulty to not get bored during combat. There's also a nice amount of variety of enemies to fight as well. Across your journey, you'll be fighting goblins, dark wizards, mythical creatures, trolls, and so many other enemies. They all feel very different, so every time you encounter a new enemy, it always feels fresh. I don't want to spoil every type of enemy you fight, but just know there's a lot of variety. There are a few gripes I had about the combat though. The beginning of the game doesn't start you out with a ton of spells, so you find yourself doing the same exact combos for the first few hours. So sometimes it felt a little monotonous to fight in my first dungeon, for example, because I didn't have many tools in my arsenal to change it up a bit. That of course changes once you learn new spells to make it more enjoyable. And as much as I liked the challenge, it did get a little annoying to get hit by an enemy off screen that you couldn't even see. They give you a Spider-Man-esque marker over your head when enemies attack, but sometimes it didn't appear quick enough or it just wasn't noticeable enough because of where your eyes have to go during combat. It never felt too unfair, but there were moments I got annoyed when another wave of enemies would appear when I'm not even done with the first wave. When you're not busy fighting, you'll be spending a lot of time doing puzzles and side activities inside Hogwarts and out. There's tons of collectibles in the castle that you can find. The game has you collect these pages for a book to fill out your codex, and it gives you background info and lore on the castle. There's these fly key thingies from the first movie that I forget the name of to collect that unlock something in your common room. No matter where you go, there's probably something to collect around you. If I'm being honest though, there might have been too many of each type of collectible to the point it started to feel like a Ubisoft game. I think there's something like 150 pages to collect in Hogwarts alone, and not all of them even gave information you could read. The amount of stuff to collect can feel pretty annoying, especially if you're a trophy or achievement hunter. The good news is these collectibles don't clutter up your map, so it's not as annoying as an Assassin's Creed game, for example, but I did think there were too many collectibles. Since this is a modern AAA RPG game, there's also a gear system in the game as well. Now this is something that could either make or break the game for you. Personally, I'm a Destiny player, so this is right up my alley, but I can see how it's not for everyone. This game really takes the Assassin's Creed approach to how gear works. Each item has an offense and defense stat. Higher level gear will also award you with higher offense and defense. Higher rarity gear gives you slots for traits that you can insert that'll give you higher damage to certain enemies like goblins or dark wizards. None of the traits really felt like they added much benefit, so I didn't really mess around with it too much. If you like certain items, you can upgrade it in the room of requirement, and that will increase its offense or defense. Another nice touch is that if you like the look of a certain robe as an example, but you had another robe with higher stats, you can make the higher stat robe take the appearance of any item you've collected without losing the stats. Even if you sell those lower stat items, they'll always be available as an appearance option once you've collected it. If you're into games that'll let you min-max every stat, then you'll like the gear system here. If you're not into that type of thing, then the good news is that it never really feels required to progress the story. You can pretend the armor upgrades don't exist and just keep putting on the highest stat gear without upgrading anything and still feel effective. Though that does bring up the question of if this system was needed anyway if you can just ignore it. I know it's an RPG and RPG games are supposed to have stats and armor and things like that, but the game doesn't really give you the urge to get into the weeds and upgrade stuff. The effects felt too minimal for me to care. The flying mounts in the game were pretty cool, but the controls felt very awkward no matter how much time I put into it. You use the right stick to move up and down and the left stick to move left and right. It felt like the flying controls could have used some more time in the oven because it never felt right or natural to me. They should have pulled from the Battlefield games or Anthem to make the flying feel really right. Even though it's a lot of fun, it needed more time and I didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. On the opposite spectrum though, one feature I really liked that I wasn't expecting to was the room of requirement. It acts as a hangout spot that you can fully customize, similar to something like the neighborhood in Fallout 4. You can customize the floor and the walls, conjure furniture, set up potion and herbology tables, conjure up decorations, and so much more. There were a lot more options to decorate than I initially thought, and there's enough there to make the room feel like it's truly yours. I'm usually not into things like this in games, but I actually had a lot of fun organizing things and setting up decorations all over. It was a nice surprise for something I couldn't care about at all before I played. The soundtrack and sound design of Hogwarts Legacy is awesome. The music is of the same style as the movies. It really captures the essence of John Williams' original score. There are tracks that feel upbeat when roaming a place like Hogsmeade that make you feel at home and fuzzy. There's some tracks that feel epic and wondrous when you're in locations of importance. I don't think there's a single bad or out of place track in the entire game, and I think the sense of familiarity and nostalgia added to it. The sound design is also great. Some spells have a cracking sound as you whip them at enemies, and the bigger creatures have a sound that adds to their sense of scale. You can tell the developers put their all into making the game sound good and appropriate for the world it takes place in. I did have one technical issue when it came to sound though. When changing the pitch on the male character specifically, I had an issue where the voice lines for my character had two audio tracks play at the same time. You could hear some sort of reverb effect because of it every time I spoke, so I had to put my voice pitch back to the default setting. No idea if this will be fixed in the day one patch, but it is something to keep note of. Luckily, the game lets you adjust the voice pitch without making a new character, so I was able to get around that issue. Hogwarts Legacy is definitely a game that is carried a lot by its name and its world. It's obvious the developers cared and loved making this game, and they love the Harry Potter franchise, and it shows with the level of detail put into it. The story and side quests feel just fine, but the strongest aspect is definitely in the combat and exploration of the world, and that just may be enough if you're a fan of Harry Potter. In that aspect, I think it's a definite day one buy for you. If you aren't already a fan of Harry Potter, there's enough there to still get enjoyment out of it to warrant buying. Just don't go in expecting this game to be a new benchmark in gaming like Elden Ring was last year. It's a very fine game with a solid foundation.